Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel, Tomcat Stitchery. I'm Whitney. We're back for another Sunday Sew Along. We are on week 6 of the B6702 Sew Along, and today we are tackling the collar and collar stand and the button bands. We've not done that yet. And the reason we have to do that now is because I will be attaching my bodice to my skirt at this point. Obviously, if you're just making a button-up shirt, this is moot. You're not be attaching a skirt, but for the pattern, I will be attaching my skirt. So that's what we're doing today, and going through how I attach my collar to my shirt, and yeah, all the bells and whistles that go along with this. This is a fun step, and I know one that can be a little bit intimidating. So definitely, if you all have any questions whatsoever, leave them down below. I will answer them as quickly and as best as I can. If this was a good tutorial, if you really enjoyed this one and would like to help support the channel, I do have a Ko-fi account. It's linked down below, which is basically like a virtual tip jar. All money does go right back into the channel to help make better and more professional sew-alongs as the channel grows. So much appreciated. Also, I talk about a tailor's, I can never remember the name of it. It's not a tailor's point because that's a little different thing, but it's basically a tailor's board. Tailor's board is what it's called. For pressing my collar open, and I will have a link down to that. I think Wallwack has one. I actually inherited mine from my mentor Joyce, but Wallwack does have one. They have a whole bunch of different curves and stuff like that that help you get into different parts of jackets and shirts. Just makes pressing a little bit easier. So if it's something you're wanting on a Christmas list, that's definitely one to put on there. I will be doing a video on that, by the way, on maybe things you might want to add to a Christmas list for yourself. So stay tuned for that. But that's all I've got for today. So again, leave any questions you have down below, and I will see you guys next time. Bye. Okay, so we've got a little bit longer day today because we're going to attach our bodice to our skirt, and then we're going to put on our button bands, which it shouldn't take very long. And then we are going to do our collar and collar stand. Sorry. Sometimes my brain gets ahead of what my mouth wants to say. Okay, so I've got my skirt in one hand and my bodice in the other, and we are just going to sew these together, right sides together at the waist seam. This is a very easy step. You just want to match your notches, all your raw edges should match. It's a pretty, well, I guess depending on your waist size will determine how long of a seam it is. Mine's a fairly long seam. So I'm just going to put a couple of pins in here just to keep everything correctly oriented. And I will, well, it's not too bad, I guess. And I think with this one, I'm actually going to sew with the bodice up just because it has the darts, and just to make sure that I'm not accidentally getting a dart turned the wrong way. I'll probably do that. So really, my seam lines of the bottom skirt match up with either darts or with seam lines of the bodice. So that's very nice and handy. Okay. Once I'm happy with that, we're just sewing the waist seam. Right sides together. 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay. All right, right, once I've got my seam sewn, I'm just going to serge it really quickly and then press it up towards the bodice. So I'm going to do that off camera just because that's a very simple thing. So I'm just going to, serge it, press it up towards the bodice, and then I'll come back and we'll put our button bands on. Okay, so I have sewn the bodice to the skirt, obviously. I have serged, pressed it up, and then because I've got so much top stitching detail on the rest of this dress, I went ahead and top stitched the seam on the bodice side all the way across that waist seam. That's completely up to you. You can do as much or as little of that top stitching as you want. But yeah, I just decided to go ahead and do that since I've got it everywhere else. Okay, I also forgot to mention what steps we are doing in the pattern because I am skipping around. So let's see, we just sewed the bodice and the skirt together, which is 17, step 17. And now we're going to do the button band, let's see, in the collar, which are steps 18 through 30 is what we will be doing today. 18 through 30 if you're following along with this 6702 pattern. Okay, the next pieces that we are going to need here are our button bands. You should have 4 of them. This is piece 10 in the pattern. Just going to set this over here. So you should have 4. You should have 2 that are interfaced and 2 that are not interfaced. So the 2 that are not interfaced, we are going to set aside. So you want the 2 pieces that are interfaced. Now, so far in this sew along, I've been doing a lot of sewing things to the wrong side so then we can top stitch correctly on the right side. And I could do that with the button band, but I do like the way that it looks really nice and crisp doing it the correct way, where I'm going to sew to the right side and then we'll sew it to the wrong side. So it's kind of up to you. You can do it either way. I don't know why I switch it on that one, but I do. So that's what we're going to do today. So basically what we're going to do, you've got the whole front opening of the dress here. And there are notches, but it's a rectangle, so I'm not even going to worry about that, to be honest. So we'll do one side, and then the other side I will do off camera. But I'm basically going to sew my interfaced piece right sides together with one of the sides of the opening of the dress. It doesn't really matter. Okay, so I'm going to sew with the interfaced button placket up because it is the more stable piece of fabric. It has interfacing on it. And we're sewing at 5/8 of an inch, and we're just sewing all the way the whole length of the dress. Sewing the interfaced button band to the front of the dress. Okay, once you've got your dress sewn to your button band, you can definitely go and trim this seam allowance, which actually isn't a bad idea because there will be buttonholes eventually that'll be going on here and that'll just be less bulk to have to deal with. So I'm actually going to go and I'm going to trim about half. And as always, when you're trimming seam allowances, you want to make sure that you're not trimming something you don't want to trim. Especially when you're doing such a long seam as this button band. Okay. All right, once you've trimmed that, let's go to the ironing board and you're going to press that seam towards the button band. So I'm going to go do that really quick and I'll be right back. Okay, so now we are going to take, obviously I'm just showing you one side, so you would obviously do this on both sides. we would take our uninterfaced piece and we're going to put it right sides together with the interfaced button band. All the way down. So the interface button band gets sewn to the front of the dress, and then the other side of it gets sewn to the uninterfaced button band. Okay, and now we're going to sew that, again, with the interface side up. That's just a good rule of thumb. If you have something that's interfaced, as best as you can, sew with it up. And again, 5/8 of an inch, we're going to sew that whole length. Okay, once you have sewn that seam, again, trim that seam allowance in half, being very careful. Okay, once you've trimmed that seam allowance, I'm actually going to go and press the seam allowance between the interfaced and uninterfaced band open. I'm going to press it open just to make it nice and crisp, because this is going to get obviously folded over onto the wrong side. So go and press the seam you just sewed open, and then we'll come right back. Okay, once you have pressed that open, that seam open, you're going to then press the uninterfaced side to the wrong side, and then you're going to tuck up your 5/8 of an inch seam allowance and make sure you cover that stitching line, and then just stick a pin all the way down. Our ends are raw, and the pattern says not to do that. It says to stop. We're not doing that. I like to hem my stuff a little differently. So we're just going all the way to the bottom. So now what we're going to do, now that we have that pinned, and I actually leave those pins because I have them in there perpendicular to the fold. I actually leave them in while I'm sewing. I find that that helps just a little bit to catch everything. But I'm going to sew a line of top stitching along the outside edge and also along the inside edge, about, I don't know, 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch in from the fold and in from the seam line, both on the button band. So I'm going to do that really quickly down both sides. And I'm actually going to do the seam down the top stitching down the seam first, so that nothing shifts, since that is unsewn as of yet. Alrighty, then you can go back and pull out your pins and just make sure that you caught everything on the back side. And we're good. So there you have it. You can baste at the top and the bottom of that placket if you want. I'm not going to because it's all pretty secure there. But that is one placket all the way down. So I'm just going to do this on the other side, and then we're going to tackle our collar. Okay, so once you have both those plackets done, we're going to set that aside for a minute. So we're going to actually make our collar. Last two pieces of this pattern. It's your collar stand and your collar pieces. If you're using the 6702, this is piece 11 and piece 12. Make sure on this that you mark all of your notches, because those are going to be very important. You are cut 2 of each, and then we are interfacing. I think I already went through what steps. Yeah, sorry, I'm filming the collar on a different day than I filmed the placket. Okay, so for both your collar pieces, you will have one that's interfaced and one that's not, and the same with your collar stand. You've got one that's interfaced and one that's not. Now, general rule of thumb for this is that you want the piece that is facing the public to be interfaced. So that means like the top part of your collar, you want to be interfaced. Now, when it comes to your collar stand, unless you're going to be wearing your collar popped and turned up a lot, then you would want the outside piece interfaced. I prefer to have the inside piece interfaced on that, because that is kind of what shows more, because the collar covers the other piece, if that makes sense. So those are my preferences. So we're actually going to construct the collar first, and then it gets attached to the shirt dress. So put aside your collar stand pieces for right now. And you're just going to take your two collar pieces, and we're going to put these right sides together. And you'll notice on your collar, you've got like a longer side and a shorter side, just the way that the curve, a tighter curve and a longer curve. So you can kind of see, obviously, the tighter curve. I also apologize for the noise. My kids are at home today with school, and so it's just very noisy. So I apologize for the background noise. So we have our inside curve and our outside curve. The inside curve is what's going to be attached to the collar stand, and the outside curve is the outside part of the collar. So, right sides together, and again we are going to sew with the interface piece up. That's just a good general rule of thumb. And basically what I'm going to do is get this lined up nicely. I have one that's finished with school right now, and the other one is still working, so it's not... Okay, so again, this is the inner curve that's going to get attached to the neck band. So we are going to go, or the collar stand. So we are going to go up, around, and down. Okay, so this bottom part, we're going to leave open for right now. So 5/8 of an inch, I'm just going to sew up, around, and down. It really helps if you turn on your machine. Now, there's a lot of tricks for how to get a really crisp point on your collar, you know, doing a one stitch at the corner diagonal. There's a whole bunch. The way that you trim it, I mean, I just kind of go real simple with mine. I just pivot at that point, and I've never really minded how sharp my corners are. But definitely, if you have another tip or trick that you like to get a really sharp corner, you can definitely use that there. So maybe you can see better on this side. But I basically just sewed from the raw edge up, turned the corner, sewed all the way across the top, and then went down to the raw edge again. And now I am going to clip my corners. Now, if you're using a heavier, you know, if you're making like a corduroy shirt or something, you can definitely grade your seam allowances, which is where you clip one shorter than the other so that there's just a little bit less bulk. I mean, I'm using a cotton lawn, so I'm not going to worry too much about that. But I am going to trim my seam allowances in half, just like I did on the button bands. I also believe my daughter's doing PE in the other room. She still has a couple, she has to do her PE work, and then her, I think she still has math to do. But I believe that's why we're hearing so much noise in the other room. Okay, so once you have trimmed, I like to use, I mean, it's definitely not necessary, but I use one of these. This is a point turner or a tailor's, tailor's point. What is this called? Anyway, it looks like this. They can look in a lot of different weird shapes, but basically it allows you to get in and press these seams open, the short, and then you can put it on the long. You don't have to have one of these. It does make it, you know, nice and easy. And then you put it on, you know, across the top and just kind of go section by section just to get in and press open the seam allowance on your collars. I like mine. You can get them at Wawak. If you're interested, I can leave a link to that down below. But I'm just going to really quickly turn this right side out, however you'd like to do that. Turn this right side out and give it a good press, and then I'll be right back. Okay, so when you've got everything all nice and pressed, and I used a double-pointed knitting needle to actually push out my corners, but the side that is not interfaced is going to be the underneath your collar. So when I was pressing, I kind of favored that seam allowance, if you can see, just to that side, just as best you can. Now, some shirt patterns actually have a different undercollar piece than they do for the top collar. A lot of times there'll be a center seam and they will cut it on the bias. You'll see this in coats a lot, in blazers, as well as you'll see it in shirt patterns as well. And that does help things to roll a little bit better. But for most Big Four patterns, it's usually just the same piece cut twice. And in all honesty, with shirting, it does the job. You know, I don't know that it makes as big of a difference as opposed, you know, if I were making a blazer and using wool. But yeah, and a lot of times the undercollar is cut a little bit smaller than the top collar so that it helps to roll to the inside so that you don't see that seam. But again, we're working with shirting, so it's just a little less obvious. But now I'm going to go and I'm going to top stitch 1/4 inch all the way around the collar, including I'm going to close up this bottom part too. Okay, but I do want to make sure that I know which side is the interfaced side. I can kind of see just by the seam allowance that's left which one is the interface side, but if you want to do some kind of a mark or something in the seam allowance or just with chalk that can be washed away, because we do want the interface side up. So anyway, I'm going to top stitch all the way around and do the 1/4 inch even along the bottom just to keep that together when we get to the next step. Also for this, make sure that you are sewing with the interface side up. That will make a difference. You don't want to catch any excess fabric. So now we have an interfaced, a top stitched collar. Okay, so that's pretty easy. Now we're going to attach our collar band. Okay, when you look at a collar band or a collar stand, sometimes it's called the neck band if you don't have an actual collar on it, you'll see that we have this curve that goes around. And when the shirt is worn, you know, that's the part that will be down. So the top part of this is what attaches to the collar. So sometimes that's kind of helpful to visualize basically, but you should have some notches here. I may have to recut the ones that were interfaced. Sometimes that happens. This is where notches become quite important. Okay. Sometimes that's helpful just to recut those notches just so they're easier to see. Interfacing can act like glue. Okay, so this is my interfaced side of the collar that is up. So this is the right side of my collar. So I'm going to pin this. Now you'll notice how I'm pinning that, and I'm gonna put this in an orientation that maybe you can see a little bit better. So this is the back part of my collar. So this is going down, if that kind of helps. And your notches will match up, but that's going down. So you've got 2 dots on the edge of the pattern. That gets lined up, excuse me, with the edge of your collar. I mark those as notches. They're just easier to see. And then from that point, you should just be matching notches. And this is right sides together. And again, I'm putting the interfaced side of my collar band against the top of my collar. So also the interface side of my collar. All right, now for this first one, so with your interface side up, I'm literally just gonna sew from the edge of the collar to the other edge of the collar at 1/4 of an inch, 3/8 of an inch. We're basically just basting this in place. Do that real quick. Okay, now we're going to sandwich our collar. So now I'm going to flip this over and put my other collar band right sides together with the other collar band piece, and your collar is going to be sandwiched in between that. So hopefully that makes sense. And now we're actually going to sew from the raw edge of the collar band around this corner, all the way across, and then all the way down to the raw edge on this side. And we're doing this at 5/8 of an inch, which is the seam allowance, and we want our interface side up. Okay, so I'll show you on this back side that you can see we've sewn all the way around to the other raw edge. So you just want to, the most important part of putting the collar band on, and it's not hard, but just to make sure you have it, you're sewing the right side to the right, you know, the right edge of the collar band to the right edge of the collar, which sometimes you just have to keep looking and make sure you've got it all oriented right. So now what I do is I go and I'm going to cut about, I'm trimming my seam allowance, and I'm going to cut about half of the seam allowance away. But when I hit those corners, I cut really like 1/8 of an inch away from the stitch line. And then after the corner, I go back to like half. This gets a little bulky because you have 4 layers of fabric and 2 of those are interfaced. So you definitely can grade the seam allowance where you're just cutting each layer at a different length to help with the bulk. But again, I'm using a cotton lawn, so I'm not going to do that. And then when we get back to this corner, we cut pretty close to that stitch line, like 1/8 of an inch away, and then back to half. So I'll show you what that looks like. So you can see how close I get to the stitching line at the corner. It just helps it turn so much better. All right, and then once we've done that, you're gonna flip that collar band right side out, and it should look like this. So now I'm gonna go to the ironing board and obviously press the collar band away from the collar and get that all nice and pressed. And then we're going to attach it to our bodice before we finish the top stitching. So I'll be right back as soon as I press that. Okay, so got my dress, your shirt, whatever. So now it looks like this. So now we're going to attach it to our dress and our shirt. So we're going to pin it, and I will definitely take you up close and personal as we put this in. So the reason that we're doing this last on this is that you have to have your bands all installed, obviously, because this is how you finish off the whole top of the dress or shirt. So what we're going to do is we're going to pin our uninterfaced side. So you're going to want to find, this one is my uninterfaced side. This is my interface side. So we're putting the uninterfaced side onto the right side of the shirt. And basically, you are going to, and again, I'll pull you up close here in just a second. We're going to push that seam allowance that's there kind of out of the way, but you want that seam allowance right there to line up with the folded edge of your button band, basically. So we're just going to pin that in place, and then it really is just a matter of notches, matching up notches. So I've got a notch here. And then there was a shoulder. Again, the shoulder does not match up with the yoke seam. And I mark center back, which is not a notch that's on the pattern, but I like to mark that because it's just another helpful point. Oh, I just totally unthreaded my machine. Well, and sometimes I'm just gonna go and pin this and then work my way back to the middle. So again, push that seam allowance out of the way. You want to line up the edge, that seam allowance right with that edge. And I'll pull you up here in just a second and you can see that up close. Okay. All right, so now I have just that an interface piece pinned. So I'm going to pull you up in front of my lap and I will show you close up what that looks like, and then you can watch me sew it after I've threaded my machine. Okay, oops. So let me show you again what I mean about that seam allowance. So that is the seam allowance of my two collar bands. And there's the stitching line, and I want that lined up. Which actually, it's not lined up all that great, is it? I want that lined up just right with the edge of that button band. So basically, if you can see, there's the seam right there. I have the edge right next to that seam. Okay? So I am actually, now in this case, technically, it would be great if I could have this against the feed dogs, but I need to be able to see those seam allowances. So this gets sewn up. So we're just going to go slow. I'll do a lot of sticking my hand in between the layers just to make sure that everything looks okay. I want that bumped up a little bit more. Okay. So I'm going to put this gets so hard with the, there we go. Okay. I'll zoom in here. Just hold on a second. Let me get myself all figured out here. All right, so we were sewing this at 5/8 of an inch. So I'm actually going to line her up and I'm going to pop. And something else to mention, you really want the edge of that button band at the 5/8 inch mark down here lined up with the seam allowance. Not so much at the top is not as important because that's your seam allowance. Like that's not as important. Okay, so I'm right there at the stitching line and I've pushed the seam allowance and everything away from me. And it gets a little fiddly, but it will all work out here in just a minute. Okay. Anchored. All right, so now we're just gonna go very slowly and I'm gonna stick my hand in between. So my hand is against the body of the dress. Just I don't want to catch any pinches. Again, if you catch some pinches, it's not the end of the world. It's pretty easy to go back and unpick just that section and get it all in the way it's supposed to. But you're also sewing convex to concave curves together, so you want to make sure you're honoring that. Underneath here. I also want to say, if you are more comfortable with hand basting this in place first, by all means, there's nothing wrong with that. And that will give you nice, precise results. So if that helps, I know there's a lot of people that make just gorgeous results that do hand basting, and it's more times than not well worth the extra time. So if you've got more patience than me, patience is a virtue. Okay, we're gonna come right up to the stitching line again. And then right before that seam allowance. Oh, that shifted. Gonna go through, make sure we don't have any pinches on the shirt side, and we good. Okay, that looks good. But as you can see here, I've got a pretty big gap, about 1/4 of an inch between where I want that with my edge. So I'm going to unpick that. Oops, sorry. I'm entwined in the tripod. So I don't have any pinches to fix, so that's good. But I'm not super happy with how far that is. That's not going to look the way I want it to. So we're just going to unpick a little bit. Okay. Oops. All right. So just go back. You just want to unpick where you need to unpick. And then just re-sew that little section. Oops. Then you pull your pin out. How did that happen? Amateur hour. Okay. Okay. So now you can, we're going to trim and clip into this because we do have a curve that's here that we want to honor. But don't get too close. Don't clip too much here yet. So what I would actually suggest is maybe, I don't know, go in like 2 inches and just kind of ease your way in and cut that down to about half. Let me scroll out. Now, this is an area where you really want to be careful that you're not clipping something you do not intend to clip. Make sure nothing's folded up on itself, that sort of thing. And then the same when you get to the other side, like 2 inches from the edge. There's some bulk there at the yoke. Okay, and we will trim that, just not yet. Okay, now you can just go in the area that you trimmed if you just want to put in some clips. Clip 2, not through your stitching. The tighter the curve, the closer you want your clips. There isn't like a super, super tight curve. It's more around your front of your neck. We'll get to that in a moment. Also make sure you're only cutting what you want to cut. Okay. All right, now we're going to do, so obviously, let's look at our shirt here. So basically, this is the inside of our shirt dress, whatever. So obviously the finish, when all is said and done, this is going to get folded up. That will get finished off and folded in all the way around. And then your shirt will fold over like so. So I do this a lot like I do my cuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to turn your interfaced piece kind of back over on itself a little bit. And we want to match. So this is the raw edge and we're wanting to sew this. So here it is again. We've sewn this to the shirt. Here is our seam right here that sewed the 2 collar bands together. I'm going to wrap that around my collar band. So this is very similar to what we were doing with the cuff. So you just want to make sure things are nice and tucked up in there. We will check before we clip anything. And now I'm just going to sew right along that same stitching line for like, I don't know, 3/4 of an inch, an inch. You can definitely pin if you'd like, which isn't a bad idea. This can get a little fiddly because it's a very tight space. So literally that's as far in as I'm going to go. The further you go in, the more chance you have of catching something you don't mean to catch. And then when we pull it out, we'll see how lovely that looks. Obviously it's bulky, but you want to pull that out just to make sure you haven't sewn anything erroneously. So now I'm going to turn that back, wrong side out, so that I can, oops, clip this at an angle. And then I usually like to kind of go in here and trim down, because you have a lot of bulk there at that band. So I'll trim just a little bit more of that band out. So then when we go back, right side out, got some stray threads. It looks really nice and neat. Okay, so obviously we need to take care of that, you know, the rest of this all the way around, which we'll do in a second. So now we're going to do the same to the other side. So we'll do this again together. So I'm going to fold this back inside out basically. And then here is my seam allowance of my, the top of my neck to my collar band. So there's my seam. I'm just going to wrap that edge. I'm actually doing this through the viewfinder instead of, I'm going to put a pin this time. Don't have to go far. Okay, I'm going to flip it over, and I'm going to sew right on that seam line again. We're going to flip it right side out. Make sure we didn't catch anything. That looks good. Go back in. Nothing is pinched. Oh, but look, I did pinch something. Just the edge. Just going to unpick that little bit there. And that's just the edge of that. I don't think I need, that's the edge of that back stitch. I think we're good. But I am going to clip at an angle, the tip there. Don't clip your stitching. And then I'm gonna just clip that button band. Get a little bit of that extra bulk out of there. Oops. And then you turn things right side out. Whoop. Like that. Okay. So now we're going to go, I'm going to go to the ironing board, press this seam of the shirt up into the collar, and then you're going to fold this right so it just covers your stitching line all the way around, and put your, I like to put my pins in perpendicularly. So go ahead and do that, get everything a good press, and then I will come right back and show you how we finish this off. Okay, so I've got everything pressed, and you can see all of my pins. I've just pinned and folded as I've gone to pin everything over the stitching lines. And I've got it pinned perpendicular. So there's a few ways that you can go about sewing this down. So obviously this is the inside of the shirt. So it's going to be wrapped around your neck most of the time. But again, unless you're popping your collar a lot, which I don't, my sister does, but I don't. you're never really going to see much of the top stitching except just what barely wraps around your body. So it's up to you which side you want to top stitch from is what I'm getting at. You can definitely finish this off with a slip stitch so that you can't see it at all if you like, if you're not wanting to do top stitching. I put top stitching on this shirt anyway. So I'm just going to go ahead and top stitch this down. I'm actually going to sew from this side, although I could, because my pins are perpendicular and you can kind of feel from this side. And I think I'd be fine if I stayed, within the circumference there, within that line. But I'm going to go ahead and top stitch from this side because that's what I'm choosing to do. And because it's the interface side, so it might make it just a little bit easier to have the other underneath my presser foot. So it's up to you. So now I'm going to top stitch all the way down, and I'm going to top stitch around my collar band. I'm going to start in the middle. Not really the middle, kind of the middle, because that'll be tucked nice and nicely underneath my collar, and then you don't have a start and stop back stitching right there at the front of the shirt. Now, I do want to say I'm going to be sewing very close to the fold on this piece. So that being said, even though there's my stitching line, you can see it right there. I'm going to be on the opposite side. So if you look, like, my stitching line is probably going to be on the shirt and not on the collar band, if that makes sense, because I want that stitching line to be covered on this side. So keep that in mind. But again, it's under my collar, so I'm not really, it's up to you. It's whatever your level of, however you want what matters to you and how you want things to look in the end. You can also, see, I'm totally leaving my pins in. You can also hand baste this in place first before you top stitch it. It's the nice thing about this industrial. You got a nice big area to the right. Around the horn. Okay, so I'm going to pull all of my pins out first, and then we're going to take a look at the wrong side, and I'll show you what I mean. The other thing is the way that I wear my shirts. I never have it buttoned all the way up to the top. I always have my shirts unbuttoned for that V-neck effect. So that's another thing to consider. If you are buttoning your shirt all the way up to the top, you may want to top stitch from the other side, because then this side would be much more visible, even with the collar down. But as you can see it rides right along that seam line, and it kind of, it goes off in places. Not bad. It pretty much rides right along that seam line, but again, I keep mine open, so you see this side more when I'm wearing mine. So that's just kind of how you determine. But look, guys, we have a collar. We have a collar. So, yeah, let's go over to I'll put this on the mannequin and we can look at it really quickly and then end for today. Okay, so as you can see, it's shaping up. So the last steps that we have to do is hem and put our buttons and buttonholes and buttons on, and we are finished with this shirt dress. So if you can see what I mean, this is how I will typically, obviously I don't have the buttons on yet, but I typically wear mine. I don't even button them all the way up to the top. So you see the inside of my collar band way more than you ever see the other side. But if you are someone that buttons it up to the very top, you know, you will see a little bit of the other side. So it's just kind of up to you. But I always have mine open. So that's why I choose to top stitch from that side. And again, you can base. There's a lot of different ways that you can do that. But I hope that was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. And next week we will be putting on or doing our hems. And both for the shirt or the shirt dress, I'm just going to send you to a different tutorial for the shirt tail hem if you're doing a shirt. And then we'll be doing the dress hem in the sew along next week. And then we'll be putting on our buttons and buttons. Buttons, holes, putting our buttonholes and buttons on. Okay, I will see you guys next week. Bye-bye.